This is the One Thing Podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Adam Rindy. The One Thing Podcast brings together leaders in functional and naturopathic medicine to discuss actionable information that may unlock puzzles in the areas of gut health, brain health, metabolism, and longevity. Please note, these episodes do not replace the opinion of your doctor. They are not intended to diagnose or treat any condition. Please discuss this information with your provider and discuss your own unique personal health history before adapting this information. Please subscribe to our episodes so that you can stay on top of the most current information in these areas of medicine. With so much talk about the gut microbiome and the role of gut bacteria in health and disease, we often forget that there are other organisms living in the gut, such as archaea, bacteriophages, helminths, viruses, and fungi. In today's episode, I welcome on a world expert in the microbiome, Dr. Mahmoud Ghannoum. He has spent a great deal of his career studying fungi and the role they play in health and disease. Dr. Ghannoum is a tenured professor at the director of the Center of Medical Mycology at Case Western Reserve University and University Hospitals Medical Centers. He is the founder of BIOHM, which is a consumer microbiome testing company in the United States, and the author of the book Total Gut Balance, which is an outstanding book about the gut microbiome. In this episode, we do a deep dive into the role of fungi in health and disease. We discuss Candida albicans and fungal dysbiosis. We talk about biofilm, testing for microbiome imbalances, and much more. Having someone grounded in science to discuss the topic of Candida albicans was so helpful. This world of Candida has been conflated for many years in various circles. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Make sure during the episode, if you can, to like, subscribe, and share these episodes with others so that we can continue to provide world-class content to you. So without further ado, welcome to the next episode of the One Thing Podcast. Welcome to the live stream episode of the One Thing Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Ghannoum. I'm really delighted to have you on with us today. Welcome to the One Thing Podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yes. So we went through a lot of effort to make this happen. I really appreciate you working around schedules, and I know you're very busy.
Thank you very much. These days, especially with what's going on with the COVID and other stuff, but it's really fun to be able to finally come and speak together.
Great. So I'd like to just start off learning about like your typical day. Like what's your typical day look like? I know you're involved with a lot of things. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. I am an early riser, so I wake up in the morning around maybe 5:30. I take care of my dog, feed them, and this sort of thing, and then I go and exercise. I exercise daily about half an hour. And then once I do that, I have some breakfast, a coffee with my wife, and then go to work. Usually, the first thing I go, because I go early, I start dealing with the emails. And these days, they are more and more of them, which becoming challenging.
Yes.
But I do that. And then, with this COVID we live in, we have a lot of Zooms during the day. And so I keep going like this till about 9:30, 10 o'clock. Then I go to I have two labs, one in the hospital and one at the Case Western Reserve University. So what I do, I go from university hospitals, go up the stairs to see my people in the team there. And we go over the studies and, have a couple of meetings to discuss the progress of the work and if they have any issues and this sort of thing. And then come back, I like to have light lunch, a lot of fruits and vegetables, and just keep going. by the time the afternoon, like maybe 4 or 5 o'clock, I am really tired.
Okay.
So I come home and I enjoy taking my dog, Prince, his name, for a walk, which really I love it because it gives you a break from running around all day. And I find it to be physically and mentally very relaxing. Then I have dinner with my wife, and by 8 o'clock, I am a dead person. I just,
Okay.
yeah, I sleep in the sofa, and repeat it, rinse and repeat.
Yeah, yeah. Great. So the lab work that you're doing right now, um, is I know you're also involved with the private sector a little bit with
Sure.
like lab testing. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, the center I direct has two components. One, it's a medical mycology, Center for Medical Mycology, where I study fungus. I get funding from the National Institute of Health to study the pathogenesis of Candida and other fungi. Also, to study the microbiome, especially the mycobiome, which we can talk about, which is the fungal community. Also, what I do is I help really pharmaceutical and biotech companies to develop their drugs. So I have a number of models, the preclinical, in test tube, as well as animals, to evaluate new drugs or drugs candidate. You
Hmm.
know, and if things goes well, I also have a certified lab, which is we act as a central lab for clinical trials when they start giving the drug to patients and this sort of thing. So that's one section of my lab. The other section is called Integrated Microbiome Core, where I start looking at the microbiome, which is, as you know, a hot area. I started about 2008, 2009, and now we go into various aspects of the microbiome in health, whether it is gut health, cancer, or more recently, we are looking at autism and stress as well. So,
Great.
yeah,
Very interesting. And I know we're going to get into talking about this beautiful book that you wrote,
thank you.
The
Thank you.
Total Gut Balance.
Thank you.
I just really enjoy it. It's really well put together and combination of science and practical suggestions. So the best kind of books.
Thank
So
you.
and so when we're talking about the microbiome, I think it's was helpful to understand that there are players in this ecology that are beneficial. There are some that are potentially problematic. Maybe breaking that down for us to understand the 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 functions that the microbiome play that are
Sure.
um,
Yeah,
helpful to us and potential, harmful.
yes, I think this is really a good way to put it because people should know that there are some good fungus as well as there is some bad fungus. And sometimes there are fungus that normally, such as Candida, let's take Candida because everybody talks about Candida. Candida is present in maybe 50 to 70% of us, even when we are healthy. So it is an opportunistic organism. In other words, when it is present at low level or low abundance, it will not cause any issue, health issue for us. In fact, it could help us. Like when you
Mm,
have candida in our gut, it breaks down some food which bacteria can take and produce byproduct, which again candida can benefit. So it's really very good cooperative or mutualistic interaction. The problem starts when you kill the good bacteria, such as lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is
yeah.
one of those probiotic strains which is beneficial. So when you kill it, what happens? Candida start to overgrow. And when it overgrows, it takes over. And it's very interesting, this interaction, because what happens when it overgrows, it can keep lactobacillus under control. So it's as if, okay, now I am more of me available. Let me keep that bacteria that wants to overgrow. So here, the nice interaction for us to understand is that there are at good times, as long as it's low level, the fungus, which is pathogenic, is beneficial. We should not let it overgrow because it could cause trouble.
Hmm.
One last point I want to talk about, we forget about the good fungus, such as Saccharomyces cerevisiae, for example.
Yeah.
This is, as you know, we use it in baking and beer making. This is very good yeast also present in our gut, which, by the way, when it is there, it really is very helpful.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's even we can talk about later, probiotic supplementation with yeast, such as Saccharomyces boulardii,
Sure.
uh, and so there's a good point you make in the book about the fact that a lot of the information around candidiasis and yeast dysbiosis has sort of been marred in pseudoscience, or in just sort of, well, if we don't know what to call it, let's call it Candida, kind of like thrown in as a um, almost like a catch-all diagnosis. Um, and I think it's really good of some of the things that you talk about in the book that really delineate where this is something really to hang your hat on. Can you kind of go into that?
Yeah, sure. Like as you said, there was when many years ago when I first came to the US, I went to a meeting and everybody is talking about the yeast connection.
Right.
Where people say anything you have, any health issues actually, whether it's gut, whether brain fog or whatever, they used to blame it on Candida. Okay, but in fact, it is not. This is not the case because, as I mentioned, Candida could be present. In fact, we have it in our mouth, in our gut. I can give you a laugh. When I was teaching undergraduates many years ago, I told them, listen, why don't we have a test? Let's see, take a swab and let's see how many of us have Candida. And it was more than 50% had Candida in their oral cavity, in the mouth.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think about it, if you become, let's say, HIV infected patients, AIDS
Right.
patients, they have their immunity is down. So then you have a problem with Candida. So it's very
Right.
important to differentiate between the two and put it into perspective.
Right. Yeah. And when I was first introduced to Candida or Candida syndromes, back in 2002, 2003, we were actually working on an HIV clinic, in an HIV clinic, and that was before HIV really had better management. Most of the patients weren't doing so well, and yes, the first thing we would do is look in their mouth, and lo and behold, thrush, which is that oral candidiasis, was common, and we would spend a lot of time trying to get that under control.
Yes.
So it's interesting though, because with chronic illnesses and chronic lifestyle and stress and various other um, environmental stressors that we face today, that uh, a number of patients who don't fit the category of like the severe immune suppressed will develop issues with yeast, correct?
Yes, yes. And that's, as you can imagine, it's because of the dysbiosis or imbalance in our gut microbiome. If you have an imbalance, then you will start to develop uh, as yeast infection and other sorts of bacterial even dysbiosis, which could affect our immunity. And as you know, when our immunity is weakened, Candida could start to cause issues.
Hmm.
And that's why a lot of the time I remind people that Candida is an opportunistic organism. In other words, it takes the opportunity when we have uh, whether our immunity is down, whether you have a cancer, whether in transplant patients, for example, other fungi can come. So definitely this balance is very important and need to be controlled. Uh, but normally, as I mentioned, I really don't worry about Candida. Uh, and in the book, as you know, we gave some guidelines how we people to hopefully reduce the effect of or the increase in the abundance of Candida.
Yep. Yep. Well, since you're a researcher, I would love to kind of have you take us on a journey to the mucosa of the gut. And like if we were in a lab looking under some type of imaging at an environment that um, has become overtaken with Candida
Yeah.
albicans, for example, um, what would the mucosa look like? Because it's you talk a you use a lot of great analogies in the book, which I really love. Um,
Thanks.
I would just love to hear your
Yeah.
take on like standing in the mucosa and looking around in this environment. What will we see?
Okay, that's really very interesting question because you are absolutely right. When Candida, let's look at Candida as we said, when it is not over abundant or not overgrown, it's fine. It will live like with other organisms like bacteria, and they work together, and if in fact they help each other, as I mentioned. So now let's say now Candida started to increase, and I give you a good example. We looked at Crohn's disease patients. Okay, and as you know, Crohn's disease patients, they have a lot of inflammatory symptoms. And what
Hmm.
we found that there is an increase in Candida, especially Candida tropicalis. Other scientists or investigators showed that also Candida albicans increase. At the
Hmm.
same time, we saw that there is an increase of bacteria, E. coli and Serratia persistens. These are two pathogenic bacteria, which means they cause disease. And what we found, because to come to your question, is for the first thing they do when they come together, they adhere or they stick to the epithelial lining, our coverage, the epithelial cell lines that cover, that basically really keep our gut intact and not perforated or leaky, for example. Okay, so they come there, they adhere. Once they adhere, they start to talk together and they start to form what we call a biofilm. Okay, the best example of a biofilm for people listening is really like the plaque in our teeth. The plaque in
Yeah.
our teeth are biofilms.
Yeah.
And as you know, what we do, we clean our teeth to get rid of it. Unfortunately, we cannot do the same for our gut.
Right.
So let's go back then to with respect to the imagery. Okay, so they stick there, they start to grow, and they start producing these carbohydrates or polysaccharides that it's like jello. It's like jello that covers them. And then as they cover them, they start to change their shape. Like Candida, instead of becoming like a yeast or like oval shape, it start to form what we call hyphae or like filaments,
Hmm.
little threads. And these threads, they come into our cell lining and they start to poke holes in it, start to invade it. And when this happens, then we start to have leaky gut and other issues associated with it. So to me, for people to imagine, look at, as if you have a tent. Within this tent, there are all these microbes, bacteria and fungus working together, and they are covered by like jello. Okay, and that's where the jello is sitting on top of your gut lining.
Hmm. And they change form, right?
Yes, they change form from being oval or rounded, let's say, a little bit round cells, what we call yeast. They change form, become elongated. It's become like thread we call hyphae or filaments. And these hyphae, it's fascinating when you look at them. I did studies before. At the tip of the hyphae or at the tip of the thread, if you will, there is phospholipase or phospholipases, which means they break down the lipids in our cells and to go in. Also, they secrete other proteinases, which can break the lipids, sorry, the proteins. So you have something, an enzyme that can break down the lipids, and the other that can break down the proteins and allow them to invade.
Wow. Yeah. So um, that's a highly intelligent system, and it just kind of makes me wonder, where what the advantage is for, is the yeast trying to get into our system? Is that a better place for it? Is that
You see what happens normally when it is in our gut and we are healthy and it is not overgrown, it stays there, and it doesn't bother us, it helps us. But once you have an overgrowth of it, of course it wants to invade, to go to our bloodstream. Okay, in fact, the first time a scientist, a German scientist in fact, did a study, what you know what he did? These days they will not allow you to do that. He drank some candida. He grew candida cells, and he drank it, and guess what? It forms and it invaded his bloodstream, and he nearly died, but he didn't. But this was the first evidence that candida, when it overgrows, it can cross the gut barrier, and cause systemic infection all over the body, especially the kidneys and this sort of thing, and the brain.
Yeah, yeah. And so, we're learning so much about once that barrier is breached, how that affects other organs and other functions. Can you just chime in on what your kind of basic understanding of the downstream effect of that is?
The downstream effect is the first thing happens when candida goes through and invade. These cells go towards our organs. For the number one is the kidney, especially in the case of candida. Other fungus sometimes go to the lung, but we are talking about candida. It goes to the kidney, and you can imagine when it goes into the kidney and start to proliferate or overgrow, then we will have kidney failure. Okay, and the other thing, if it is not treated, we left it untreated, it will start to go to the brain. And we did studies. We found that when you inject an animal to understand the disease, it goes from the kidney at the very beginning, but after 2-3 days, you find it in the brain as well. So it starts to spread systemically, or we call it disseminated candidiasis. It goes to the spleen, it goes all over, and really, if we don't treat it and we don't think about fungus when somebody has it, a lot of the time could lead to death. Okay.
Interesting. And so the natural kind of questions that come out from this is like, besides the obvious seeing thrush in the mouth and those types of things, and maybe like chronic yeast infections like vaginosis, those types of conditions, how would someone feel on a daily basis that has like a yeast issue? Like, I mean, there's bacterial issues, there's viral issues. Is there like a flavor to the yeast scenario that kind of would tip someone to think that they have a yeast issue?
And I think we need to look at listen to our body. Like, if you start to have sometimes it could lead to some bleeding, in our fecal sample. Sometimes you have a pain as well, some pain. So if you think it is fungus, then what you need to do, first of all, people a lot of the time, they just treat bacteria. They think bacteria only. Like, to us, it's very important to start thinking fungus. If you take antibiotic and it doesn't go, then guess what? You need to start to think of fungus to treat it. And if you give somebody an antibiotic and 4 days and you still have fever and whatever, don't just switch to a broader spectrum antibiotic or another antibiotic. Think fungus, because if we don't think fungus, it could be detrimental.
Right. Yeah, I remember reading some research not too long ago, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, about the differences between small intestinal fungal overgrowth and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth.
Yes.
And there was a few features about the yeast symptoms that were slightly different, but there was a lot of overlap. I think nausea was mentioned as being more common in yeast. Is that what you have seen?
Yes. The nausea definitely is one of them as well. If you have SIBO versus SIFO. Yeah.
So your book does a really good job of helping people go through like a questionnaire and kind of understand maybe their own unique dysbiosis. Can you just briefly share like some highlights about I think you use 3 different subtypes?
Yeah, what we did is you really need to look at, there is a checklist, which is risk factors. So you look at where you born, for example, C-section. Where do you have antibiotics too often? Do you look at all of these that could have issues with the GI tract? Now, to try to refine this, recently, my company called BIOHM Health, what we did, did a new test called guttesting.com.
Okay.
And what in that, we refined it more. We looked at thousands of people who sent us samples, and we looked at people with dysbiosis, and we tried to identify what factors could tell you have dysbiosis. And it's a checklist. It's more refined than that in the book. Okay. And if you check those, at least you check 3 different things in it, then you certainly have dysbiosis. Okay. Now, the other way you can do it is you can, of course, take a test, microbiome gut test, where you send a stool sample or fecal sample, and then we analyze it. And there are other companies that do that as well. You analyze it where you see your profile compared to healthy people. And based on this, you will be able to tell. And we look at both bacteria and fungus. Okay. So we look at, for example, the level of Candida albicans, tropicalis, and glabrata. At the same time, we look at, do we have Saccharomyces, for example, because it's good to have Saccharomyces. So you look at the beneficial organism and those that are pathogenic, and the balance between them will guide our nutritionist to say, look, okay, you should, these are the following recommendations, whether dietary, lifestyle, and supplements.
Gotcha. So I've done a lot of the PCR tests over the years, and it seems like it's really hard to pick up yeast on those. Is there something about your technology that's, or the way that you're testing that's different to really zoom in on the yeast population?
Sure. PCR, usually you do what you call quantitative PCR, which you have a probe specific for a given species. Because as you know, there are different species of Candida,
Right.
which we mentioned some. Whereas now the new technology, which next generation sequencing, what it does, it really looks at markers called ITS, internal transcribed sequence, where it can identify not only one Candida, but can identify all other species as well. So it is more sensitive than PCR.
Okay. Okay. So that's the technology you're using, is kind of you said ITR?
ITS,
ITS. Okay.
and it really it takes the DNA of the microbes in your gut and then sequence using special primers that can detect different fungus.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. And like the old test of like ONP cultures in comparison, um, those are highly specific, right? But not very sensitive.
Exactly, not very sensitive. When you use the culture-based approach, mainly you can grow Candida and Saccharomyces, but you cannot grow everything else. Like even different species of Candida, it may not grow. So that's why the non-culture-based, which is DNA-based, is much more sensitive and much accurate.
Okay. And then this world of metabolomics, where we're looking at the byproducts or the metabolites that yeast produce, and measuring those, is that something that is ready for prime time, or is that the future?
I think this is really the future. I think this is a very important area because not only will we'll be able to detect whether somebody has disease or not, it's going to allow us also to understand how these fungus can cause the disease and what do they do, how they affect our immunity, how they do this. So to me, I think it's the next generation of this studies. And in fact, we started to do this. We looked at, it's very interesting. Remember, we talked about how we found Candida tropicalis, E. coli, and
Hmm.
Serratia. What we did, we looked at their metabolites, what small chemicals they secrete. And we looked at each one alone, and then we looked at them when they are together. And what we found, there are 199 sort of metabolites secreted. But we found when they are together, there are 7 of them are differentiated differently. Like it's really unique to the fact
Hmm.
that when they come together. So now we
Interesting.
are going after those because those will allow us to understand how the disease or the effect of Candida in this. In fact, I have a grant from the National Institute of Health called RO1, which is investigator-initiated grant, to look at the interaction between bacteria and fungus, including the metabolites they secrete. So I hope
Wow.
I hope we
Very
can get
interesting.
something. Yeah, this is the future.
Wow. Yeah. It's always been my understanding that one of the metabolites is like an aldehyde or has kind of like a
Yeah.
alcohol like effect. Um, Especially when you start removing yeast, people can feel really sick. Um,
Yes.
is that a thing, or are you seeing that in the lab, or is that just sort of a concept that is just out there?
I think it is still concept out there. As I said, I'm really looking very hard into this area, and I'm collaborating with colleagues of mine who are in the gastroenterology. And we are trying to put the yeast and start to look at the metabolites as well as at the immune response, because how do they affect our immunity as well?
Hmm.
And we have a paper which should come out really very soon. It's sort of accepted, but the reviewers wanted some more things to be done. But it's very interesting. We found that, having this a candida can affect our immune markers, okay, cytokines like interleukin 6, for example, and this sort of thing. And now we are also looking, can we use probiotics to keep this under control?
Yeah.
And it's very interesting mentioning the metabolites. We have a probiotic which is in the market, BIOHM probiotic. We started looking at the strains. Do they produce metabolites, okay, that are beneficial? We are still doing it. We detected some, but I like to wait till we have more solid data and this sort of thing. But definitely, this is bring us back to the same idea. What you said is metabolites now or in the future. I think it's gonna be very soon in the future.
Oh, good, good. So I know one of your passions is nutrition and food, and the approach to healing the body through those modalities. First of all, I'd like to just kind of hear where that came from, like in you, and like what drew you to the world of nutrition and kind of food as a medicinal approach. And then I just love to hear some highlights about your general philosophy about nutrition as it approaches yeast dysbiosis.
Yeah. I can tell you the first time I started looking at the nutrition or the nutrients to deal with Candida was many years ago. In fact, I have a paper which was published in 1988. What happens, a friend of mine at the department where I was working, teaching microbiology, he every morning he comes and tell me, he knew I work in Candida, of course. He said, you have to study garlic. I said, just leave me alone. I don't want to study garlic. And, but the guy was such a good guy. Guess what? I started working on, okay, will garlic affect candida? And in fact, I published 3 papers after that on the effect of candida, sorry, effect of garlic, which, as you know, called allium sativum, on candida. And it was really fascinating study. We showed that it it affects the uh, ultrastructure, the morphology of the cell. You know how the cell is yeast or
Mm-hmm.
hyphae,
Mm-hmm.
it breaks it down. It starts causing the cell to collapse and die. And then when we looked chemically into that, we saw that it affects the lipids in in the cells of candida, as well as the proteins in the cells of
Mm-hmm.
candida, and that's how it kills it. So that was my first encounter with the diet.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, after I did my work in Crohn's disease in 2016, people start reaching out to me and uh, asking, so what can we do about it? And that's where my son Afif, he told me, Dad, we have to make a company to understand this. And really, we went full throttle to try to understand how candida is affected by diet and this sort of thing. And that's what really culminated in the book, as you say, Total Gut Balance.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I was introduced to your book from a Crohn's disease patient, and I don't think a lot of people really understand the Crohn's yeast connection. But I mean, even there's certain diagnostic tests that are used in Crohn's to look at certain antibodies to yeast. Correct?
Yes, yes, which is like it really was developed based on Saccharomyces, but yes, they use it.
P. osca.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And what they do really now in our study in the Crohn's disease, we found that people with a high elevated level of the ASCA, whereas uh, the normal did not. So there is definitely a correlation in that.
I see. Great. And so, oh, that's interesting. You know, and so your son is involved now with helping. Um,
With the company, yes,
kind of
yes.
wonderful,
Eh,
wonderful.
it's fun, to have a. I never thought I'll work with my son.
Yeah.
He's a lawyer, but honestly, it's fun. And sometimes uh, I shout at him. you know, he said, "Dad, leave me alone." So we have good fun. We have good fun.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, moving forward with your company, just I would love to kind of hear more about like how what you're up to. You talked a little bit about the
Yeah.
metabolites. Is there any tests going to come out where we understand that biofilm is developed? Are we going to be able to one day, do a lab test and indicate that someone has a biofilm issue, or is it just sort of presume that there's biofilm?
I worked on biofilm for many years before this, before the gut issue. You remember when somebody goes into hospital, okay, they put catheters, and
Hmm.
these catheters, organisms stick and form biofilm. And
Right.
to come back to your question, is there a test? We tried to look at certain proteins which are specific to the biofilms, so that we can use them for detection. You know, and honestly, we were unable to do it, and many people could not do it. It's very difficult to identify it and image it, because you need biopsy, you need stuff which is not possible at all. So it's not as easy to do a test to tell you whether you have a biofilm or not, uh,
Yeah.
at the moment, at least.
Yeah. I think that would be really helpful clinically, because now at this point, basically people who are non-responders to treatments that should work, we assume there's some biofilm at play that,
Sure, sure. I think uh, one way is like what we talked about, is if you expect or you suspect that you have gut issues with Candida, I really think taking the gut test, microbiome gut test, will help you. At least it will tell you if you have Candida or not. You know,
Yeah.
uh, but it's not specific to tell you whether you have biofilm. You assume it is in a biofilm. You know why? Because these organisms are in our gut and they are not free floating. It's not like in the lab, you know.
Right. Yeah, that's I mean, I'm kind of getting into sort of the minutia of this, and I apologize, but this is a topic
Oh,
that I'm very passionate about. But I've always wondered if, we're not able to pick up on Candida or other organisms on some of the lab tests because they are ducking out in biofilm, and that's kind of why they evade testing.
this is really very, very important area. And for years, even now, we have diagnostic tests that does not show you, even though we know from biopsies or that it is there. Okay. So to me, we have some tests which are like, for example, beta D glucan test. Beta D glucan test is a good test that could complement the culture testing. Okay. So I think, and that's you take a sample of blood, you measure it. If you see this beta D glucan, then the chance of you having the candida is high. So
Yeah.
we are getting better in this area, but it's not perfect, you know.
Right. Right. Wonderful. Well, I'd love to hear more about ways people can learn from you and learn um, what you're up to. Are you doing any programs or any kind of education along with the book that you wrote?
Yes, I'm starting to get, I prepared actually some continued education presentations to educate people about the microbiome and how its effect, give you over a few overview of the effect on inflammation, leaky gut, and this sort of things. And also, what I'm trying to do is writing an article demystifying the microbiome, and
Hmm.
publishing it. I recently published an article which you heard about microbiome-based approach to really managing depression during COVID. So
Hmm.
I'm trying to be all the time to be publish, so that people know. And we also have at Biome Health there is a microbiome report where we have podcasts. Andrea, who runs that, she meets different people to try to educate people about our gut and this sort of thing. Also, Biome Health, we have a lot of information now to help people understand with their gut.
Wonderful.
So yeah.
Okay. Well, in closing, is there any sort of parting words that you could maybe share to like a clinician that's listening to this or a patient that might be struggling with thinking they might be dealing with a candida or a fungal or microbiome issue?
I really think it's very important for clinicians to start expanding their knowledge in this area, because it is very clear based on really huge number of peer-reviewed articles that the microbiome play a role in this business. It is very complex situation, so I really encourage them to learn this, because I believe by understanding the microbiome and the possibility of dysbiosis is there, the microbiome could be a new tool to help their patient. Okay, so with respect to the people, I am a great believer in you need to listen to your body, try to follow few things which gonna help you if you have gut issues. Number one, diet is very, very important. Please follow the diet that is healthy. Try to cut, as we mentioned, sugar. Try not to eat processed food, uh, packaged food with a lot of sweeteners, for example. Not very good. Try to, in addition to, eat some fibers, eat some cruciferous fruit, vegetables. And finally, I really think you need to also look at lifestyle. it will be very important to start to do a bit of exercise. You don't have to kill yourself. Moderation
Mhm.
is the way to go. So exercise, try to reduce stress. And I mean, it's easier said than done these days, but try to do some meditation, try to do yoga, go out for hikes, because stress, even if you eat the best food, guess what? We You still can have microbiome imbalance. And finally, if you can also help yourself by having a little bit better sleep, that will be really fantastic. But all in all, talk to your loved ones, talk to people, share your issues, because it's always will be helpful. And I wish you all the very best.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ghannoum. This was really enlightening. A lot of really good
Thank you.
information came out of it.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate the fact that you have me. And have a great day.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the One Thing Podcast. Please share these episodes with your friends, loved ones, colleagues, patients, healthcare providers, anyone who you feel might benefit from hearing these informative interviews. We tend to learn best from people sharing things with us. That's often the first time it's introduced. So don't hesitate if the content of these episodes reminded you of someone that might benefit from it. Forward the episode to them, and I'm sure they'll either appreciate it or be appreciative that you've thought of them. So once again, we'll look forward to seeing you next episode on the One Thing Podcast. And again, much appreciation for you being here with me.